3 ferries. That is what Russia has now lost in the Azov Sea to Ukrainian drones. Not warships, not missile boats, but the humble, ugly, absolutely irreplaceable vessels that carry cargo trucks and fuel trucks across water that Russian commanders once considered their private lake. 2 of them were struck within a single recent wave of attacks. The third had already been knocked out earlier. Moscow sent these ferries down from the Russian Federation itself, specifically to keep supplies moving into the occupied territories, because the land routes were already bleeding. This is not a story about 3 boats catching fire. It is a story about a sea being slowly closed from the shore of a country that, on paper, no longer has a navy. How does a state with almost no conventional fleet strangle maritime traffic across an entire inland sea? And what happens to an occupying army when the water stops working for it? To understand why these ferries matter more than their size suggests, you have to look at what the Azov Sea actually does for the Russian war effort. It is a logistics artery. Fuel, vehicles, construction material, and general cargo move across it toward the occupied south, easing the pressure on rail lines and on the Kerch Bridge, the same bridge Ukraine has attacked repeatedly, and the same crossing Russia now restricts out of fear. A roll-on, roll-off ferry is the perfect tool for this job, because it does not need cranes or sophisticated port infrastructure. Trucks drive on at one shore and drive off at the other, which means every ferry lost is not one hull removed from a list. It is an entire moving bridge erased from the map. And Ukraine understood this earlier than most observers did. The first of the 2 recently struck vessels was the ferry Maria, the larger of the pair, the one built to carry full-size cargo trucks and fuel tankers on its deck. Ukrainian drones found her, tracked her, and hit her. The damage, based on the imagery that surfaced afterward, did not send her to the bottom. It did something arguably more useful. It made her unusable. The superstructure, the part of the ship where the control room sits, appears burned. A vessel that cannot be steered, cannot be certified, and cannot be insured is, for military logistics purposes, already sunk. The second ferry, Yeysk, was smaller, suited for lighter vehicles rather than heavy trucks, and she was struck in the same campaign. Add the earlier hit on the ferry Sky 1, and the pattern stops looking like luck. It starts looking like a target list being worked through, line by line. Here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. Why would Ukraine spend its long-range strike capacity on ferries and tankers instead of on warships? Because the warships already left. The Russian Black Sea Fleet pulled its valuable combat vessels back from exposed anchorages long ago, after losing ship after ship to naval drones and missiles. What remained in the Azov Sea was the commercial layer, tankers and cargo vessels that are civilian on paper but exist to sustain either the Russian economy or the Russian military directly. Satellite images of the sea show clusters of these vessels, and according to the analysts tracking them, most of the ships visible in those images have already been hit. That is not harassment. That is systematic interdiction, conducted with machines that cost a tiny fraction of the ships they disable. And notice what the target list says about priorities. The ferries carrying fuel trucks were struck first and hardest, because a fuel truck delivered is a battalion that can move tomorrow, while a fuel truck stranded on a burning deck is a battalion that waits. Ukraine is not attacking ships. It is attacking the future movements those ships would have enabled. And the asymmetry is the entire point. A single one-way attack drone, built for the price of a modest car, does not need to sink a ferry to defeat it. It needs to start one fire in one critical compartment. The ship then spends months in repair, if repair is even possible under sanctions, while its route stays empty. The crews of other vessels watch this happen and draw their own conclusions. Insurance vanishes. Civilian operators refuse the run. This is how a sea closes, not with a fleet blockading it, but with a risk calculation that no ship owner is willing to make anymore. What was meant to be a protected rear area supply route turned into a zone where every hull is a liability the moment it leaves port. Russia's own reaction confirms how deep the wound goes. Moscow has stopped allowing additional ships to enter the Azov Sea at all, and traffic through the Kerch Strait has been blocked or heavily restricted. Think about what that means. The occupying power, the side that formally controls both coasts of this sea, is the one rationing access to it, because it can no longer guarantee that anything floating on it will survive. Even Russian channels have been sharing the strike photos themselves, with captions admitting that Ukrainian hits on Russian ships in the Azov Sea continue, and that Ukraine is gradually disabling Russian infrastructure. When your own propaganda space starts documenting your losses, the information battle in that sector is already over. There were small, almost desperate details in the aftermath imagery. On one of the struck vessels, the crew had rigged ropes across the deck, an improvised measure, presumably against drones. The ropes changed nothing. The fire reached the control section anyway. This is a pattern that repeats across the entire war. Improvised nets, cages, ropes, and screens, bolted onto machines that were never designed to survive in a sky and a sea filled with cheap guided munitions. Sometimes these measures buy minutes. They do not buy back the initiative, because the decisive moment did not happen when the drone struck the hull. It happened hours earlier, when the vessel was first located, identified, and logged, and from that moment on, everything else was scheduling. So here is a question for you, watching this. If you were responsible for supplying an occupied coastline, and the sea route was dying, the bridge was restricted, and the roads were hunted by drones, which option would you choose, and what would it cost you? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is exactly the dilemma Russian logistics planners are living through right now. Step back, and the strategic picture sharpens. Ukraine lost most of its conventional navy in the first days of the invasion. By classical doctrine, that should have ended the naval war. Instead, Ukraine rebuilt sea power out of surveillance feeds, satellite imagery, one-way strike drones, and unmanned surface vessels. A navy without sailors on the water. The Azov ferry campaign is that doctrine reaching maturity. It is no longer about single spectacular hits, but about denying an entire body of water its economic and military function, week after week, at a cost the defender can sustain indefinitely, and the occupier cannot. What each side gained and lost here is genuinely mixed, and it is worth being honest about it. Russia still holds the coasts, it still moves supplies by rail and road, and it retains the ability to strike back at Ukrainian ports and vessels. Ukraine, for its part, has spent strike assets on targets that will eventually be replaced or repaired, and Russia adapts. Routes shift, timings change, defenses thicken. War is always a race of adaptation, and the losing side of any single exchange still has options. But the direction of travel is visible to anyone reading the satellite images. The Azov Sea, once advertised as Russia's internal lake, is now a place where Russian ships burn and Russian authorities restrict their own traffic. The side that sees first does not need to strike first. It simply schedules the strike for the moment that hurts most. So the open verdict stands. If Russia finds a way to defend or replace its ferry capacity, the occupied South breathes easier, and this campaign becomes a costly nuisance. If it cannot, then every liter of fuel and every truck bound for the southern front must squeeze through crossings and roads that are already under the drone microscope, and the front itself starts to feel the thirst. Which of those two futures do you think is more likely by the end of this year? Tell us below. The ferry story is one chapter, and your read on the next chapter genuinely shapes what this channel covers next. If this breakdown helped you see the naval war differently, press like right now while you are here. Share this video with someone who still thinks sea power requires ships, and subscribe so the next analysis reaches you the moment it goes live. Until then, watch the water. It is telling the truth faster than the press releases are.